welcome to today's video. So in today's video I'm going to talk you through what I wrote in my research proposal for my dissertation. I got a mid-first and my research proposal was made up of the intro, method section and then my ethics plan at the end. So I am doing a BSc in psychology at the University of Manchester, so if that sounds similar to your course, then this research proposal structure and outline may help you. So you need to view your introduction like a funnel. So you need to start really broad, thinking of your real life motivation. Why is it useful that we study whatever you're studying? What are we going to learn? Are we going to learn something new about people? Is it going to help us have a deeper understanding of what we already know? What is the motivation behind why this topic needs to be studied? And this needs to be on a really broad level here. So thinking about, is it going to change human behaviour? Is it going to allow us to have an insight into why people do what they do? Is it going to have any influence on policy change? What is the consequence of learning about what your study is about? Then you need to tell us, what do we already know? This is where every time I say a point, you're getting closer and closer to what your hypothesis and what your actual research question is. I suppose you could say, have this fear of being accidentally plagiarising myself. So I'm not going to talk real specifics about my study, as I don't really want to find out that that's some new form of plagiarism that I've somehow done to myself. So I will try and explain what my dissertation is without going into detail. So you've got your real life motivation. Why should we be bothered about this? You're telling us what we know about that topic. Now my topic is about human biases and the biases that we as humans do, and the way that we do things. We're not always correct, and that's because we have a bias. So I would then write about that. Then I wrote about some different types of biases. Then I zoom in on the bias that I'm particularly researching. So I define this bias. I then do a big literature search on what is already known about this bias. How do people behave? How does it make people behave? What scenarios have you got that show that people exhibit this behaviour? Or where are the places where people don't exhibit this behaviour? What's the difference between those? So it's about identifying a gap in the research. So if I find that my bias has not been tested in a certain area, then that is the gap in my research, and that will then be what I then focus on. So for mine, I'm looking at a particular human bias, and I'm looking at consequences and the effect of consequences and how that affects if people exhibit this behaviour or not. So then I identified the gap. That is one of the most important things. What are you giving that hasn't been given before? So for me, it's about consequences and human bias, and whether the consequences affect the human bias. So here I can cite any sort of literature where there has been evidence of where consequences have made an impact and where the consequences of it have influenced the bias I'm looking at, or any other type of biases. Are there any sort of situations where this hadn't occurred where people thought it would? Maybe look into why that was. Is that a thing that might occur in your study? That's just for you to consider later on. So you've identified a gap in your research. So mine is to do with human bias and consequences. And then my dissertation is adding a new feature. So this is how VR can be used in these situations to essentially create a consequence that is more lifelike. This is where I'd hone in on why I'm using VR, how I aim to use this VR, and how this is going to help me answer how the consequences affect the human bias, and whether we see that pattern and whether it exists or not. This should narrow down and lead neatly to your research questions. So this is explicitly what you're going to be studying. Then you need to come up with your hypotheses. Do you have previous research that tells you it should be a certain way, or don't you? So essentially, say whether you've got a directional or a non-directional hypotheses based off what the research you've already cited for earlier on in this paper. So everything should be really neatly leading down. It should make sense why you've gone through each step to the other, and you've added in and you've become more niche as you've got to the bottom. You then have your hypotheses, and you should explicitly state what you expect these to be and why. And obviously this is based off the previous knowledge that you've cited and key research that you've cited in your introduction. Now, if your supervisor has given you somewhere to start with, so in my first meeting with my supervisor, he gave me 3 papers to look at, they are going to be key crucial papers, and that means they need to be in this, because that means they're important in the literature and they are an important part that helps me kind of cave out how I'm going to funnel it correctly. These key bits of research need to be in there, otherwise you're going to be lost and it's not going to be clear how you're getting to your research question from it being so general at the top as to what are the implications of what we find. Because you're essentially starting with, what am I going to find out from doing this research? And then you go into the broad area of the general area, the area you're studying. Then you niche it down, and as you niche it down to your research question and hypothesis, you then move on to your method section. So for your method, you have your participants, which is how many people you intend to recruit to do the experiment and how you recruit them. You then have your design, which is how your experiment will be set up, essentially like a recipe, like step by step, this is what will happen. Then you have your materials, which is what you need. So say you're having a computer, it'll be what's shown on the computer, how long is it shown for, like how many seconds, and it's that information. If you gave someone your method section, they should be able to replicate your experiment or research. So the procedure spells it out really simply, step by step. What is that participant's experience going to be? That's what you need to write. You need to write it in the most concise way that you can, but also make sure you're not missing things out. Then I need to do an analysis section, which is where I just sum up what tests I'm going to be using. So mine is a 2-way repeated measures and over, I think. So it's what hypotheses you're testing, how you'll present this data, and then that is the end of the main part. Now, for my ethics, I have an ethics table that I needed to fill out, which obviously if you did A-level psychology, then it'll come back to your whole consent, psychological distress, any counselling or debrief that you need to offer. Is there any, not lying, but is there any deceit going on in the study that you need to not tell your participants in order to not have the experiment ruined? So I have to sort of lie in mine, because otherwise I wouldn't get the data that I needed. So you write about that, you write about what else is there, you write about the conditions that the experiment's under, is there any exclusion criteria, is it like if anyone has a fear of spiders then they can't do it, like you need to be specific about what possible issues could an ethics board have to decline your research. Is it a bit extreme? Does it have the right amount of research and the right amount of citations and relevance to actually be useful and to be useful as a study? Mine was pretty simple because I just joined in with what my supervisor did. I didn't come up with it myself. But if you do come up with your dissertation idea yourself, then you really need to think about ethics. Can I get past ethics? Ethics can take months, because they've got to go through so many people's papers and make sure that they have the rationale behind their study and that they've thought of every single little thing that could affect this participant ethically, whether that's working with animals, children, or if you're working with children, you need a lot more ethics put in place. Also, I think you need to be DBS checked, and there's a lot more to go in with if you want to do work with vulnerable participants. If you've come up with your dissertation idea yourself, you need to speak with your supervisor about, is it feasible, is it doable, is there enough research there, is there a gap in your research that you haven't found anything to fit it with. That might be what you need to study instead of what you think you're studying. Basically, your dissertation is going to add to the research field, and you can either add knowledge, like I said, or look at changing policy, or even just psychology is just about human behaviour, and if we know more, what can that allow us to do? So yeah, I hope that was helpful. I mean, I feel like the dissertation thing's I'm finding it very overwhelming, and I'm just trying to pick it back up, and all I'd done is my research proposal, but because I did really well in it, I thought there's probably something in that I need to think about when now trying to write my actual thing. So yeah, like I said, think of it like a tunnel or a funnel, both. Start more broad in the general sense and get more specific until it's so obvious what your hypotheses and questions are going to be that even the person marking it doesn't even need to read it. It should be that clear, and like, this is the pathway that we're going. If you've read something and it doesn't really relate, get rid of it, because you only need what's relevant here. I was stuck with a 2-page limit, so that's why you need to get rid of all your references that aren't directly the best ones to use. Please, yeah, use them in your actual dissertation, but when you're stuck to a constraint of either pages or word limits, you need to be careful about what you keep in and what you don't. So just think, if this directly relates to my research in literally every way possible, so whether mine identifies the bias, does it look at that bias, does it look at that with consequences, does it look at that with VR, they're the kind of things that are going to be really relevant that I'm really going to want to put in my paper, versus say things that look at what else my bias affects. That's not really as relevant. It might still appear in my paper, I haven't wrote it yet, but do not put that in your ethics or research proposal because you've not got the time or the space. So I hope this was useful, and follow along with my dissertation series that I've not yet started, because I'm finding it very overwhelming and I don't really know where to go. Yeah, so I hope you found this useful. I feel like I've just rambled, so I hope when I edit it together it looks a bit more put together and like I actually know what I'm talking about, because at this point in time, I mean, I got an 80 in my research proposal, but that was 2 years ago, and my head's just all over the place and I've got a lot of work and yeah, so dissertations are very stressful and haven't even really started it yet. And I know I'm starting early, as most research proposals aren't due until like December, but yeah, I thought this video would have been useful for me, so thought why not make it. So yeah, if you found this useful, or even if you have any questions, pop them down below. I'll try and answer them to the best of my knowledge. So yeah, thank you for watching. Hope you found this useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you for the next video. Bye.